first things first, I would like to welcome and thank Professor Robert Lefkowitz, who is an American physician and cardiologist biochemist, best known for his discoveries that reveal the inner workings of an important family of G protein coupled receptors, for which he was awarded the 2012 Nobel Prize in Chemistry alongside Brian Kobika. He is currently an investigator with the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, as well as the James B. Duke Professor of Medicine and Professor of Biochemistry and Chemistry at Duke University. So first things first, let's give a warm round of applause for Professor Lefkowitz, please.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Yang. I'm delighted to be with all of you students, and I'm told there are some parents in the audience as well. So happy to share with you a little bit about my own journey, which, as you can see, I've entitled A Tale of Two Callings. Now, I'm assuming most of you have an understanding of the word calling. It's a deep-seated sense that you are meant or destined to do a certain thing. Although we ordinarily associate this most commonly with clergy, a calling to the clergy, you can feel a calling toward almost any activity. I've been particularly fortunate in my life to have experienced this sense of a calling on two separate occasions, which have led to my dual career as both a physician and scientist. And so it's that story that I want to share with you today. So my first calling, which was to the practice of medicine, was entirely due to this man, Dr. Joseph Feibush, who was my family physician in the Bronx, New York City. He made house calls, and I was just absolutely, as a little boy, just absolutely taken with what he did. He would come to the house when I or a family member was ill, carrying that black bag out of which he would produce all manner of magical objects, a stethoscope, a reflex hammer, an ophthalmoscope, etc. He'd lay on hands, prescribe medicines in an illegible script, and lo and behold, we would feel better. And so by the time I was maybe 6, 7, 8 years old, as shown here, I knew that my calling, although of course I didn't understand that term, that my calling was to be a physician, just like Dr. Feibush. And so I pursued that goal in a very single-minded way. I attended a very notable public high school for gifted and talented students interested in science and technology called the Bronx High School of Science. And from there on to Columbia College and Columbia Medical School, where I was a pre-med student and a chemistry major. I'm shown here with my parents at my medical school graduation in 1966. And from there, on to medical residency, an internship at Columbia Presbyterian Medical Center. That's me that I'm pointing to in 1967 or 68, and would have gone on happily to finish my training in cardiology at that point, hang up my shingle, as they say, and have happily practiced medicine for the rest of my life. I want to point out that to this point in my career, I had never done any research whatsoever, nor did I have any desire or interest in doing any research. I was heading for a straight career as a practicing physician. But circumstances, fate, destiny, whatever you want to call it, had different ideas because there was a very significant cataclysmic event going on at that time in the mid-60s, the Vietnam War, in which the United States was heavily engaged. It was a remarkably unpopular war. There were demonstrations, even riots. Nobody was interested in supporting that war. But as young men, we had no choice because there was a doctor draft. Now, for all men over 18 in the United States, there was what was called a lottery draft. You got a draft number, and then quite literally, those numbers were picked out of a barrel. And if your number came up, you were drafted and you went to Vietnam for 2 years. Otherwise, you didn't have to. But if you were a doctor, if you were a medical school graduate, then you were drafted. Everybody was drafted. 100% upon graduation from medical school, which for me was 1966. And then you were drafted into one of the four services: Army, Navy, Air Force, or Public Health Service. Now, if you were drafted into any one of the first three services, you were pretty much guaranteed to spend at least one of your 2 conscripted years in Vietnam, which nobody wanted. If, on the other hand, you were fortunate enough to be drafted into the United States Public Health Service, then you stood at least a chance of being assigned stateside. And if you were really fortunate, you could be assigned to one of their research establishments, like the CDC or the NIH. Well, as you can imagine, it was extraordinarily competitive to get those commissions in the United States Public Health Service for obvious reasons. But because I had high academic standing, had gone to a top medical school, good recommendations, I did get the commission in the United States Public Health Service. Obviously, that's not me. And unlike this career officer, we did not wear uniforms. We wore white coats. I was assigned to the NIH, where I spent the next 2 years. As I say, not because I was dying to learn how to do research, but because I was very interested in not going to Vietnam. So I was assigned to the NIH for 2 years, and there I spent about 20% of my time, and let's see, this is me right here. I spent about 20% of my time doing clinical duties, taking care of the patients, the inpatients, and going to clinics, and 80% of the time assigned to a laboratory doing mentored research. And this was a very significant experience for me, because I had never failed at anything in a sustained way in my young life. I had always been successful at anything that I tried by dint of hard work. But now, for the first time in my life, I met with unmitigated, unremitting failure in the laboratory. Nothing I did seemed to work. And for the first year or year and a half, I got nowhere with my project. And so at the end of the first year, I began making arrangements that when my commission expired after 2 years, that is a year later, I would go up to the Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston. That's one of the main teaching hospitals of Harvard, and finish my training in medicine and cardiology. But as luck would have it, things began to work during that second year, especially during the final 6 months. I published my first couple of papers, got just a little taste of what success in medical research could feel like, was intrigued, a little excited, but certainly not enough to think that this would in any way impact my long-term plan to become a full-time practicing physician. And so in July 1 of 1970, I moved with my young family, a wife and several children at that time, up to Boston and began my residency. I threw myself back into the clinical work full-time. I enjoyed it. It was hectic. I had always been very good at clinical medicine, and those skills quickly returned, and I enjoyed myself. But at the end of 6 months, the first 6 months of full-time clinical work, I had an epiphany, which was that, I kind of missed the laboratory. I missed the day-to-day challenge of trying to confront a research problem, do experiments, formulate experiments, go over data, all of it. And so I decided I needed to find another mentor and begin doing research again. And so for the next 2.5 years in Boston, I combined finishing my clinical training with working in a laboratory. And then in 1973, I moved to Duke to take a junior faculty position. I've been at Duke ever since for 51 years. And there I immediately took up the dual role of a physician and a scientist. Now, initially, I would say the first few years, I did a pretty good mix of the two. I would say that I probably spent in that first year or two 60% of my time setting up my laboratory, and about maybe 40 to 50% of my time doing clinical work. But then, as the months went by and we very rapidly began making a series of interesting discoveries, I began spending more and more time in the laboratory. So that within, I would say, about 3 or 4 years, I was probably spending the bulk of my time, 80 or 85% of it, in the research laboratories, and only about 15 or 20% of my time teaching clinical medicine. And so what was I doing over the intervening years? Well, as you heard from Dr. Yang, we were able to discover what we now know to be the largest family of receptors, so-called G protein coupled receptors. There are close to 1,000 different receptors in this family, and they regulate virtually all known physiological processes in humans, including a number of our sensory modalities like taste and smell and vision. And most importantly of all, they are by far the commonest target of therapeutic drugs. In the United States, they amount to about 1/3 of all FDA-approved drugs. That's about 700 drugs, which target members of this family. The characteristics of the family, as shown here, is a protein chain which weaves back and forth across the plasma membrane, much like a snake, 7 times. So sometimes, as you see here, they're referred to as 7 transmembrane receptors. These are the molecules on the outside of cells with which all manner of drugs, hormones, and neurotransmitters fit in and bind to initiate their biological actions. They're opening up the signaling pathways of the cell, much as a key, which would be the hormone or drug, fitting into a lock, which would be the receptor. Now, along the way, I have met with some success and have learned a few things that I'd like to pass along to you, which I certainly think are helpful for those who are in a scientific career or heading for one, and might be just as helpful in other careers as well. The first is that there are 4 keys to success in research. The first is focus. The second is focus. The third is focus. The fourth you have to figure out for yourself. So I think you get the idea. Build your career around scientific problems that interest you, not around techniques or groups of techniques. Choosing a good problem is the single most important thing that one does in a scientific career. Do lots of experiments. Among the trainees I've had who were the most successful, a fairly general characteristic has been that they did more experiments than the average trainee. Don't talk yourself out of experiments too easily. Even if you have numerous reasons why an experiment won't work, consider doing it anyway. Often you'll be surprised at the result. This next one relates very much to that. Be bold. Take risks. Don't be afraid to fail. Learn to tell a good story. Both in the clinics and in the research laboratory, one has to learn that data are not a story. Data are just the raw material which you use to build a story. And any given set of data, whether it's a patient's history and lab findings or research findings in the laboratory, any set of data can be used to build a number of different stories. And learning to tell a good story, the best story, with the data that you have is a very important skill. Be ambitious. In some quarters, ambition is a dirty word. But if you want to be successful, you really need to want to be successful. You need to be ambitious. Try to view your work as play, because play is inherently a very creative enterprise. Try to see the humor in everyday situations. If you have the right attitude, it's all around you. I find that humor is a great prod to creativity, and I try to live in my lab and other meetings with a generous amount. You know, when you think about it, being funny is a matter often of seeing things in a different way, which of course is, the essence of scientific discovery. In other words, looking at the same things that other people look at with and not seeing humor, and yet you can see by juxtaposing certain elements or emphasizing certain things or putting together incongruous elements, you can see the humor in a situation. And if you think about it, if somebody is saying something funny to you, telling a joke or whatever, in the moment that you see the joke, you're essentially making a little discovery. You're in that moment understanding how a couple of things that perhaps you hadn't expected or thought were related to each other might be so in an unexpected way. And as I say, that is in essence the very central core of what it means to make a discovery. So I've always found that seeing the humor in situations is a great prod to creativity. Now, there is one caveat here. I have found over the years that there are basically only two types of people. Now, first of all, we all have the ability to appreciate humor. But when it comes to being funny, some people can be funny and other people can't be funny. Now, and you need to have self-awareness because, as I say, it's no crime not to be a funny person. But if you're not funny, my advice is don't try to be funny because, as you know, I'm sure you've heard from time to time in your life somebody who's just not a funny person trying to be funny. And it's kind of unpleasant and awkward to listen to such people. So you need to know whether you're a funny person or not. And if you're not funny, that's fine. Just don't try to be funny. Now, be enthusiastic about what you're doing. If you're not, find something else to do. When new people come to the lab, I always tell them there are two conditions that are necessary but not sufficient for you to succeed here. First, you're enthusiastic about your project. Second, I'm enthusiastic about your project. Another thing about enthusiasm is that it's very catching, very infectious. So especially if you're leading a team, very important to have enthusiasm. Be optimistic. Be doggedly persistent. There are problems that I have worked in my laboratory which have taken not weeks or months to succeed, but years. In one or two cases, decades. So you need to learn to be doggedly persistent. And finally, preparation, preparation, and more preparation. Whatever you do, whether it's giving a talk, preparing assignments for school, anything you do, preparing for a test, you can't prepare too much. And I strongly believe that when somebody looks like they're doing something well and effortlessly, it invariably is because they have prepared to a great extent. Now, how do you learn to do these things? And the answer is through mentoring, through finding a mentor, which is probably the single most important thing you can do, almost regardless of whether you go into science or some other line of work. To illustrate the point, I want to show you a scientific family tree, if you will, including myself and several of my colleagues. So when I went to the NIH in 1968 for 2 years as part of the Public Health Service, I was part of a program called the Associate Training Program. It was a small program, maybe 100 young physicians, most of us with absolutely no research experience, who were drafted and sent into that program. Now, remarkably, between 1964 and 1972, the peak years of the Vietnam War, remarkably, 10 of us who were in that program went on to win the Nobel Prize, which is absolutely a staggering percentage. We're shown here in this yellow band, okay? Here's me. And the blue rectangle encircling each of our names is meant to indicate a Nobel laureate. Okay, now, above us is sort of a genealogy, not in terms of our true genetics, but in terms of the mentors that we had and the mentors that they had and the mentors that they had. In other words, our scientific parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, etc. Everyone who is a Nobel laureate is colored blue. Well, what you can see is right off the bat, 4 of the 10 of us actually trained in the lab of a Nobel laureate. And for the other 6 of us, you don't have to go back any further than a scientific grandparent to find a Nobel laureate. For example, in my case, in the course of my career, I had 3 different mentors. Here's one, Jesse Roth. He's not a Nobel laureate, but his mentor, my scientific grandmother, was a Nobel laureate. Another one of my mentors shown here, Edgar Haber, was not a laureate, but his mentor was. And so you can see that there are these remarkable lineages. Here's one where in, I think, 7 generations, of scientists, there's a Nobel laureate in every single one, except for this guy who himself trained 2 different Nobel laureates. So I take this to mean that there are transferable elements in the process of doing high-level science that can be transferred from one generation to the next through successful mentoring. And I think this is just one extreme example of it, but it does sort of make the point. Now, in the last part of my talk, I want to allude to some of the fun experiences that I've had in my career, many of them since winning the Nobel Prize 12 years ago. So if I go back to this diagram, where there are 10 future Nobel laureates that emerged from this 8 years of people going into this program, remarkably, 4 of those 10, including myself, came from a single class. Those of us who graduated medical school in 66, went to the NIH in 68, and left in 70. Remarkably, in our class, the class of 68, if you will, in addition to the 4 of us who became Nobel laureates, was another guy. He didn't win a Nobel Prize. He did become one of my really close friends to this day. I was emailing him as recently as last week. I don't know if any of you recognize this. This is a picture of him and me 25 years later in the 90s. We first got to know each other at the NIH in the late 60s. That's Tony Fauci. And when we get together sometimes, he teases that he has an inferiority complex because he's the only one in the class who didn't get the Nobel Prize. Well, we always say, Tony, you did okay. I got to meet President George Bush when I won the National Medal of Science, and of course, the King of Sweden when I received the Nobel Prize in 2012. Also, on the way to Stockholm to receive those Nobel Prizes, there's a long-standing custom of the President of the United States meeting with the American laureates as we are on our way to Stockholm in December. And this is a picture of me with President Obama. This tradition goes way back, I think, to Dwight Eisenhower back in the 50s. But only one president since then has declined to meet with Nobel laureates, and he didn't meet with any in the 4 years he was in office. I'm sure you will have no difficulty figuring out who that was. That was Donald Trump. I've gotten a variety of honors, but none of them more meaningful to me than receiving a jersey with the number 1 on it from the famous Duke Blue Devils basketball team. I don't know if any of you follow American collegiate basketball, but Duke is always, one of the top 10 teams, and our famous coach, Mike Krzyzewski, recently retired, the winningest coach in American NCAA basketball history. And after I received the call from Stockholm in October of 2012, the very next day, I received a call from Mike Krzyzewski. I did not know him, but of course I was a huge fan, and I have season tickets and used to go to many of the games. And he said, Bob, I really relate very much to this honor you brought to Duke. He says, I brought Duke our very, very first basketball championship, and now you've brought our university its very first Nobel Prize. And so I'd like you to come down to our stadium, that's called Cameron Indoor Stadium, next week, and before the game, we'll honor you. And so I did go down there, and they brought me to center court and presented me with that jersey. And there I stood in our little stadium, which only seats about 10,000 people. The students, who you can see in the background, sit in the seats closest to the court, and they have a custom of often chanting things, in unison. Often they are taunts directed at opposing players, especially when they're trying to make foul shots. Anyway, so there I stood, and I could hear the students chanting something at me and pointing in unison. sort of like they were just pointing and chanting, and I couldn't hear it. And then it came into focus. They were chanting, "He's so smart. He's so smart." And at that point, I threw my arms up in the air and just let it all rain down all over me. So it was just an amazing moment. Then I got a big hug from the coach. So subsequently, I became good friends with the coach. We did a number of activities together. We did some fundraising for the university. And then 3 years later, the team, led by the coach, won their 5th national championship. And so they were invited to the White House to meet with Obama, shown here, and they gave him a jersey, also with his name on it. Now, this picture appeared in our student newspaper a day or two later, the Duke Chronicle. And when I saw it, I was upset because, as you saw, they had given me a jersey with the number 1, and now they were giving my number to Obama. Now, the thing is that at our stadium, there is a custom that when an outstanding player's jersey number is retired, when that player moves on, that doesn't happen very often, they make a big replica of it and they hang it from the rafters in the stadium as sort of a permanent tribute to that player. But when I had received my jersey, I figured I would do the same. And so in my office, I had hung my jersey with the number 1 from the rafters, signifying that it was retired. By the way, on the other side of me here is the Nobel Prize, the medal and the certificate. And so here are my 2 most prized professional achievements, the Nobel Prize and getting this jersey. But now they had given my number away. Well, as I said, I had by this point become a good friend of Coach K. And so I sent off a text immediately when I saw this. And I said, "Coach, you know, I'm so excited you won the championship again. I'm so excited you get to meet with the president and give him a jersey. But how could you give away my number when, as you can see," and I sent him this photograph, "it is retired and hanging from the rafters in my office?" Within an hour, I had a note back from the coach saying, "Bob, please," he says, "I understand how you feel, but please understand my position. This was the president of the United States, for goodness sake." He says, "But look, you know, and I know, you're the real number 1. So I wrote back and I said, "Coach, all is forgiven." Another big honor that I got was throwing out the first pitch at a baseball game. Now, we don't have a major league team in our area, but we do have a AAA minor league baseball team called the Durham Bulls. And so I was invited by the mayor to come down and be honored at a ceremony and throw out the first pitch, the ceremonial first pitch. Fortunately, I was given about 2 months warning. So I immediately went out just to sort of see how my throwing arm was. I was at this point 70 years old. I played a lot of ball when I was a young man, but it had been a long time since I threw a ball, maybe 40 years. And to my horror, I found I couldn't even throw at 60 feet. So if I really gave it everything I had, I could hoist at 60 feet, but it was totally wild. And so I began an intensive 2-week training program. I'm sorry, 2-month training program to rehabilitate my arm and learn how to throw again. And I talked to anybody and anybody who would help me. Particularly helpful was my teenage granddaughter who lived in San Francisco and who was a star pitcher for our high school team. And she worked with me. At lunchtime, I would go downstairs every day with whoever in my lab would catch, and I would throw the ball. Now, during this period, unfortunately, the people in the lab thought it was funny to send me these video montages that you can find online, things like 10 worst pitches ever thrown, in which various celebrities and others would completely embarrass themselves by throwing out a ceremonial first pitch and falling off the mound or throwing it at 90 degrees, whatever. Then a week before the big event, I called the Duke baseball coach and asked if he would let me work with the pitching coach. so I could learn how to throw off the mound, which is a bit different than throwing on a level. And so the big day arrived. I felt ready and confident. This is a picture from the ceremony, from left to right. That is the team mascot called Wool E Bull. Myself, Victor Zhao, who was at the time the CEO of Duke Medical Center, and on the far right, William Bell, who was then the mayor of Durham. So now the big moment had arrived, and it was time for me to do the job. And let's see. So you'll see me here walking out to the mailroom. That's a jumbotron there in the background. And you'll see I don't waste any time and I give it a big kick. It's hard to follow the ball, but watch where the catcher catches it. You saw he caught it right here in the breadbasket, right at the waist. That was a perfect strike, ladies and gentlemen. The best part was after the catcher caught the ball, he walked out to the mound. That was the Durham Bulls catcher, looked me in the eye, slapped the ball into my mitt, and said, quote, "Doc, that was one hell of a throw." And I tell you, I mean, other than shaking hands with the King of Sweden, I don't think I was ever so high in my life. This was another interesting experience. That's me together with Peter Gabriel on your left and Sting on the right. And you can see they're sort of kneeling in front of me in a show of, I guess, admiration or whatever. Now, you might say, why in the world are these two aging rockers kneeling in front of Dr. Lefkowitz? Well, I'm not going to tell you, but in a couple of minutes, I will show you where you can read about it and find out what that was all about. Okay, I want to conclude by giving you perhaps the most important piece of advice you're going to get from me in this talk. I'm assuming that the fact that you're here and you're spending your summertime listening to a lecture like this suggests to me that there's some ambitious folks here. And perhaps there are even several of you that aspire to winning a Nobel Prize. And I would applaud that. So I want to give you perhaps the single most important piece of advice that I can about how you too might win a Nobel Prize. And this relates to an article that appeared in the New England Journal of Medicine, the most prestigious clinical medicine journal. Interestingly, it appeared on October 10th, 2012, the very day I got the call from Stockholm. That said, I did not become aware of this article until a year later. And I guess it is a bit tongue-in-cheek, but you can look it up, okay? This is a real article. It's called Chocolate Consumption, Cognitive Function, and Nobel Laureates. And it plots on the ordinate, the y-axis, the number of Nobel laureates per 10 million population in different countries. And on the x, or abscissa, the chocolate consumption per capita in those countries. Each data point is represented by a flag of the country. So the first thing you can see is that there's an amazingly linear, highly significant correlation between these two variables, with only one country falling off the line, Sweden, which seems to be getting more Nobel Prizes than would be expected based on their chocolate consumption, immediately raising the question of whether they're cooking the books over there and giving themselves more prizes than they deserve. Now, why do I show you this? Well, the fact of the matter is I have been a devotee of dark chocolate my entire adult life, generally 70 to 75% cocoa. And I have had a small square several times a week, maybe 2, sometimes 3. But God's honest truth, summer of 2012, I was 69 years old, and I said to my wife, look, I'm doing well. I'm almost 70 years old. Cholesterol's good. Everything's good. Weight's good. Why do I limit myself to 1 square of chocolate a couple of times a week? I said, I think I'm going to start eating it every night. And she said, you should. You deserve it. And so sometime either July or August of 2012, I moved up to 1 square of dark chocolate 7 times a week. 2 months later, I won the Nobel Prize. So I make 2 conclusions based on this. One, there's clearly a threshold effect. And I had to exceed it by moving to daily ingestion of dark chocolate. But even more important, it's clearly very rapidly acting. Only 2 months passed between the increase in dark chocolate and my winning the prize. So my 2 most important pieces of advice to you in winning the Nobel Prize: 1, find a great mentor. 2, dark chocolate every single day. Now, if you want to read more about my life, my stories, and how in the world Peter Gabriel and Sting were kneeling in admiration before me, I suggest you pick up a copy of my memoir called The Funny Thing Happened on the Way to Stockholm. You can get it at Amazon or other places. It's filled with lighthearted stories, but also some very serious stuff about my life in Korea. So I recommend that. And then the other thing I recommend is a wonderful 4-part podcast narrated by Alan Alda. He of fame, from TV fame, and it's called Soldiers of Science, and it basically talks about those of us who were in that Yellow Beret program, that program that I told you about, where we went to the NIH as part of the United States Public Health Service. These are pictures of our applications for admission to that program back in the 60s. There's Tony Fauci, there's me, a couple of other Nobel laureates in here. So Alan Alda, the famous star of MASH, who's become quite a medical communicator in the latter stages of his life, did this wonderful 4-part podcast, which I recommend to you. So with that, I will conclude my remarks. I will stop sharing the screen, and I'll be happy to entertain any questions that you might have.
First things, let's give Dr. Lefkowitz. And once again, I would like to invite the audience to ask any questions. We will prioritize the student, but the floor is now open.
Anybody who's going to ask, please speak loudly and slowly. My hearing is not fabulous.
Hi, my name is Lucy. Thank you for your presentation. I was wondering, what are some examples of the most important G protein coupling receptors?
Yes, that's a wonderful question. And in a sense, there isn't an answer to that because there are so many drugs that target them. But just to pick one example, everybody these days is all excited about a class of drugs which were originally developed for diabetes, but which lead to weight loss. You may have heard of them, drugs like Ozempic, Wegovy, which are all the rage. They target G protein coupled receptors. But you name a disease, and I'll give you 3 GPCRs. So they're involved in just about everything. So there really isn't a most important one. And as I said, they regulate literally every physiological process in humans.
Well, thank you very much.
You're welcome, Lucy.
Hello, and thank you for your presentation. My question was, what were the most important lessons that you learned during your time at the Public Health Service during the Vietnam?
Good question. I would say the most important lesson that I learned about a research career is that you have to learn to deal with failure. Failure is an ever-present companion if you're going to have a research career. And I've had the privilege in my career of listening to sort of career talks, not just by many famous scientists, but by many famous people from all walks of life, everything you can imagine: military, law, entertainment, on and on and on, sports. And if there is a common theme to all these talks of successful people, remarkably successful people, I would say it's just how much failure they dealt with, especially early in their careers, before they made it. And boy, did I learn that when I was at the NIH. I remember during that first year when nothing was working, I was very despondent, and I was fortunate to have two very compassionate mentors who did everything they could to buck me up and, get me through it, so to speak. And that was an extraordinary help to me to have that emotional support. But I also remember one day I was sitting at lunch and another senior scientist from our branch came over to talk to me. He was not my mentor, but he's somebody I looked up to and chatted with from time to time. And he knew how despondent I was about all the failure. And he said, Bob, he says, do you have any idea for the average scientist, what percentage of his experiments might work, in terms of advancing him towards his goal? I said, no. He said, maybe 1%. I said, wow. He said, now let's take a really successful scientist, maybe even a Nobel laureate. Do you have any idea what percentage of their experiments might really work? I said, no. He said, it could be as high as 2%. Well, he was making these numbers up, but I think he was just trying to assure me that even for the most successful scientists, only a tiny fraction of what you do is going to actually work, and most of what you do is going to be failure. But of course, you want to fail smart. You learn from every failure, but failure will be your constant companion, even if you're extremely successful. And that's probably the most important lesson that I learned at the NIH.
Thank you very much.
Hi, Dr. Lefkowitz, this is Emma. Thank you so much for this wonderful talk. It was amazing.
I'm so glad you enjoyed it.
Yes, I liked your attitude in life, and I love the principles you gave, and I love how you had ambition and you followed through. Currently, I'm working with few students that are very bright. They're capable of anything and everything, but somehow they just don't have the ambition. They don't believe any advice, you could give for these bright kids, that they get that attitude, you know what, I've got it, I can do it. And I should try to avail the opportunities that are there. Any words of wisdom?
Well, that's a tough one. What stage of life are these kids at? High school?
Yes.
And you teach them?
I volunteer. I volunteer like in a speech and debate group. So I get to see these kids. They're like super bright kids, but there's so many opportunities I see they're not willing to take, because I don't know, if we talk a lot, like, I don't know, I somehow don't see the ambition in them. I don't know how to phrase it right. It's like they don't believe, even though everywhere they've gone, they've succeeded. But some of the opportunities, we really have to push them, like, you need to do this because you're capable. Like, any words of advice?
Yeah, I wish I did. I mean, it sounds like it's a generational thing. In this kind of situation, mentoring in terms of real life experiences is a very useful thing. If you can get kids like this into a program where they work with an inspirational mentor on a project and sort of get to see what it's like. I mean, I find this all the time. I mean, in general, I don't work with high school kids. My kids, the youngest, are generally college undergraduates, and most are, grad students and postdocs. But I find that motivating people is a very unique thing, in the sense that no two people it's sort of an equation that you have to solve, and the solution, I find, is different for every person. What motivates one turns another one off, and vice versa. So putting each of these kids in a mentored situation, maybe a summer of research with an inspirational mentor, so they could see what it feels like to fully engage with a problem. If you can get people to do that, to really engage with something and see what it feels like to give your best effort to try to solve a problem, especially one that you have reason to believe is of some significance. Often that will do the trick, but I'm not sure whether with these kids.
No, thank you. I think that's great advice. No, thank you for your kind words and thank you for your time.
Thank you very much for your volunteer work. That's very good of you.
Thank you.
Theoretically, we can get one more question. There's one more question from the audience. If not, in that case, I would just like to ask everyone to give one more round of applause for Dr. Lefkowitz. On behalf of CCIR and myself, I would like to say thank you so much for your words today. It's truly been an honor and a pleasure, and you're truly a really funny and delightful and inspirational speech. So thank you so much, Dr. Lefkowitz.
Thanks very much. Enjoyed meeting all of you, and I wish you good luck.